first of all, to be able to thank John and Anna and the Alliance staff and the Alliance board is not enough. I've met so many wonderful folks associated with the Alliance, and Colorado is so fortunate to have such a unique organization advancing innovative solutions to sustainability problems, and the Alliance Center as a hub of creative work. Honestly, I was like, how can we do this in DC? We need an Alliance Center in DC. It's a model that really should be and has to be replicated in other places. An incredible convening space for events, for strategy sessions, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we had just such a strategy session on the divestment movement in 2010 in the Alliance Center offices. And advancing sustainability in the state as a way to serve as a model nationally for other states, whether it's green building or renewable energy standards, whether it's developing legislation that helped establish the B Corps in Colorado, it goes on and on. So I really hope that you proudly embrace what you have here in Colorado and that you continue to support it as you are tonight by being here, and also to support it, quite frankly, financially. It is actually with great embarrassment that I say thank you for this honor, because I look around this room and what I see is my heroes. Truly, there are so many people in this room that are my heroes, and that I think it's like not okay for me to be up here, so, and not all of you and all of them. You know, I'll take a moment later and acknowledge some, but I really can't acknowledge everybody that I'm so honored to be a part of. But I think what's really an honor is that it's very exciting to be part of this growing movement to divest from fossil fuels and invest in climate solutions at an absolutely pivotal moment. And it is not hyperbole to say that this is actually the pivotal moment in historical terms that we begin to orchestrate this energy transition. And this movement is made up of individuals, of which I'm one. We know that the climate crisis is like nothing ever humanity has confronted, both in terms of the scope of the problem, the scale of the challenge, the pace and urgency of the crisis, which is imposed by the science, and where the ultimate party to the crisis, nature, can't negotiate on its own behalf, and where the impacts are huge and largely faceless. And it's a crisis where the world's most powerful actors have an awful lot to lose. We need to change the energy base of our economy, the power source that we know has brought great progress, and often great exploitation in extraction and injustice in bearing the brunt of combustion. It's generated tremendous wealth and power. And it is, in fact, that very power that is being used to stymie global, national, and local efforts to tame climate impacts and pave the way for an alternative energy system that is safe, effective, and just. In short, we must end the fossil fuel era and usher in a new energy economy. It is a tectonic shift, as profound as it sounds, and it is one that must be very rapid, as we're coming up against the limits imposed by science, by the very planetary boundaries that we've tested. So gradualism is no longer an option. We do have 2 to 3 decades to complete this transition. We have begun, but we are not on pace to do it in time to avert the worst climate impacts. And we must do it with a strategy and care for those who are impacted the most, both the workers and the communities deeply embedded in the fossil fuel system. We must care for those workers and the communities, but we must do this rapidly and strategically. So what is called for is deep social, economic, and political transformation, and that demands a powerful, creative, strategic, and brave constituency for change, real organizing, real sacrifice, not relegated to our leaders, but advocacy coming from individual leaders, from average individuals who figure out how to use their relative strengths to push on the levers of change. Leadership is anyone who pushes past their comfort zone in service of the greater good, the common good. Leadership is understanding your unique strengths, skills, and relationships to power and pushing on those levers. Leadership is giving voice and agency to those who have the least access to power, using your power, your rights in service of others, and in this case, nature as well, and doing so strategically, creatively, and with minimal resources. So I have found myself ruminating a bit on leadership lately, partly because of this and being deeply uncomfortable about accepting an award, and partly because I have an 11th grader who is in an AP US history class, who came home and told me that she had signed up for the regional history fair at the urging of her teacher. And she said the topic was leadership and legacy, imagine eye roll. And she said, honestly, everybody in my class is focusing on some, please excuse me to all the middle-aged or older white men in the room, but she said, everybody in my class is like doing a story of some white guy. And she said, you know, I just don't think that's how change happens. She said, leadership is collective. She did. So we sat in our kitchen and we talked for about an hour about social change and how social change is most effectively achieved. She said, aren't social movements led by people? And in fact, we talked about how the very definition of a social movement is that leadership is distributed across diverse constituencies working towards the same goal. And hasn't change in human history required a social movement? So just to like fill in the story, the human part of the story, she chose to do her project on the Underground Railroad as a story of collective leadership. She said, my teacher's a little nervous. The people that score these things want like the individual profile. She said, but I'm not doing that. So she proceeded to spend the next couple of months researching the Underground Railroad and the abolition movement, a movement led by necessity by anonymous people, if you think about it, people whose identity could not be revealed, yet with a very sophisticated strategy that demanded great risk and deep sacrifice. Now, I don't need to carry this analogy much further, but the history books often talk about the conductors, often largely the white folks that opened their homes at great personal risk, and individuals like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. But the Underground Railroad really was an incredible and profound story of collective leadership, those who assisted fleeing slaves, those who wrote songs, spirituals, that had codes in them that guided people north, newspaper editors who came out and took strong and powerful positions and risked losing people that advertised in their newspapers. So I bring this up because slavery was an economic system. And it was an economic system that had to be discarded because it was no longer acceptable. The consequences were too great. So I've thought a lot about this connection between the climate and divestment movement, the abolition movement. Particularly, okay, I have to share this, when you're not supposed to help your kids with their projects, but I did use spray mount and help her do the board. Remember Chevy Chase and Christmas Vacation where like, you know, it was all over our house. Don't use spray mount. But we spent so much time talking about it. And I realized that it was almost impossible to think that we could abandon slavery. And it is, at times, almost impossible to think that we can avert this climate crisis in time. In time. We'll ultimately take action, and significant action. But how much of the worst impacts will we avert? That's really the question about time. So 4 years ago, we were all really pessimistic. Hopes for a solution to climate change were at a 20-year low. The UN climate conference held in Copenhagen in 2009 ended without a meaningful agreement, and efforts to pass comprehensive climate legislation collapsed in the US Senate. The combination really of setbacks left the environmental advocacy community completely demoralized. Philanthropy, my sector, had poured tens of millions of dollars into promoting settled science. We still are. millions more into communicating that science, as if science alone would move the hearts and minds in the fossil fuel sector. We spent millions on sophisticated ground games to bring people down to Washington, D.C. to lobby for, quite frankly, public policy du jour, including the students who were brought down to D.C. in buses. And yet, each step of the way, our funding was dwarfed, absolutely dwarfed, by the resources that were poured by the fossil fuel sector into climate denial and lobbying all levels of government to prevent any meaningful regulation of carbon or its pollution, while ensuring that very generous subsidies to the fossil fuel sector continued. And it was at that moment of profound reassessment the divestment movement began to grow. Good ideas have many mothers, and the idea of using divestment as a tactic was bubbling up in various places, including in the Alliance Center here in Denver in 2010. In June 2011, 5 organizations and students from 8 universities hammered out the first plan for a series of campus campaigns calling on universities to divest their endowments from coal, launched the following August. Some campuses tested a wider fossil fuel campaign, like the wonderful and courageous students at Swarthmore. Several campuses framed their campaign by calling for clean energy investments to create the jobs, their jobs of the future. By the following spring, divestment campaigns had spread to dozens of campuses. Then, an absolutely historical event occurred. Bill McKibben published a landmark article in Rolling Stone magazine calling for fossil-wide divestment and linking it to the carbon bubble, first reported in 2011 by the Carbon Tracker Initiative. This campaign could never, ever have achieved escape velocity without the brilliant piece by Bill McKibben and the leadership of 350.org. And I believe the Carbon Tracker Initiative will go down in history as unleashing the single most disruptive concept that changed the debate on climate change. And I must point out Mark Campanelli, who is in the room. CTI documented that most of the world's fossil fuel reserves can't be burned if we can keep the planet below 2 degrees Celsius warming. And you know the story, estimating that the companies with the most carbon-intensive reserves can't burn up to 2/3 of those assets, putting them at risk to be stranded. So the combination of these events resulted in a youth-led movement focused on direct confrontation of the fossil fuel industry along starkly moral lines. 400+ campuses and spreading now to faith groups, hospitals, cities, pension funds, gone fully global, Australia, Africa, and the UK is on fire. If you've been in London lately, that is all that you hear about is the divestment movement. Students and advocates argued that mission-based institutions whose goals and constituencies are threatened by the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels should not also seek to profit from them. They linked the ethical call to a financial call, exposing the systemic risks inherent in the fossil fuel industry's business model, and called on institutional investors to act. By building a movement that defines the fossil fuel industry as a moral pariah, the movement seeks to break the industry's grip on our political process and help catalyze the global energy transition that the climate crisis demands. Fossil fuel divestment has never been about doing immediate harm to the share price of fossil fuel companies, although it is and will continue to have a dramatic economic impact. But instead, the movement is calling for a shift in capital based on the fact that we know that at this time, the leading companies are not going to fundamentally alter their business model. In the narrow window of time, we must make the energy transition. It uses divestment as a tool that focuses on the corporate powers that, let's be clear, have refused to respond to the science and adapt their business model with sufficient scale or time frame. The money that has taken our political system and our democracy, increasingly neutered it, and limited our ability to garner meaningful climate policy. This movement has exposed the problems in the business model of the fossil fuel industry, the insanity of continued capital expenditures for new sources of fossil fuels that can never be burned. Why is over $500 billion being spent annually in more pristine ecosystems when we cannot burn what we have? It's an insanity. And it's also calling for us to capitalize the solutions. In short, this movement is building political and economic power to accelerate the transition from the fossil fuel era to the new energy economy. And in this year, 2015, when governments must achieve their most ambitious blueprint for dramatically reducing carbon pollution, politicians must be willing to distance themselves from the influence of an industry that has a whole lot to lose. And for politicians to take such courageous action, a broad and powerful constituency must demand that they do so. So daunting, how can it be successful? Here's what makes this movement so unique and so exciting, and quite frankly, profoundly unique from what it's often held up as a comparison to the anti-apartheid movement. I was an anti-apartheid activist. I actually wrote my doctoral thesis on the anti-apartheid movement, which I think my mother might have read. And what's so interesting about this movement is that the call to action is not just based on a moral argument or a moral imperative. It is also based on a very powerful financial imperative. The risk that fossil fuel stocks are massively overvalued has already begun to alter the investment community's thinking. The systemic global economic threat posed by the overvaluation of fossil stocks was openly debated as a black swan event at the World Economic Forum in Davos 2 years ago, has been endorsed by leading financial thinkers from the President Kim of the World Bank. It's been cited by Ban Ki-moon, and et cetera, et cetera. It's increasingly being leveled as a warning for action in the financial community from institutions as mainstream and central as HSBC and the Bank of England. Second, it's not just based on opposition to a problem, but opens up solutions using our resources to create the new energy economy. We're not just saying get out of the bad, we're saying capitalize the solutions. Let's move our money and accelerate the transition rapidly. And the Invest side is focused on climate solutions. It's been estimated that we need a clean $1 trillion annually. Ceres has done this work, and the International Energy Agency to lead the global energy transition. But I would say a third reason why this is different than the anti-apartheid movement or other similar movements in the past. Come on, this is not a heavy lift. The anti-apartheid divestment movement was targeting companies that comprised about 40% of the S&P. Today's movement is targeting 7 to 8% of the S&P. It's not a huge universe that you're asking your investors to limit. As complex as our investment portfolios are today, our fossil energy holdings can be drawn down. Let's not forget that that's actually your money. We hire people to manage our money, and so we can tell them how to manage that money. So I ask you to own what you own. And right now, whether it's in your retirement account or you have other types of investments, if you own fossil fuels, you own climate change. And if your investment managers tell you they can't do it, or worse, they can't even tell you what you're invested in because it changes so rapidly, or there's some secret sauce they use to give you extra benefit, then there's a whole lot of other reasons why you shouldn't be invested with them. And I think, yeah, I was hoping you would clap on that. I gave you a little pause line. It didn't come. That really bummed me out. So divestment is not going to bring an apocalypse for your investment portfolio. Many recent studies have shown that fossil-free portfolios, granted it's a short time frame, are performing better than those with fossil fuels. But but I can only tell you about our own experience. The foundation I manage is 100% fossil fuel free, and it's over 10% invested in climate solutions. We've had excellent performance, we've beat our benchmarks, we're yielding substantial gains that we use to make our grants, robust grants. We were out of coal before coal dropped, we were out of oil before oil dropped, and I believe more significantly, we are protected against the upcoming volatility in the fossil energy sector as the companies are forced to address the stranded asset issue. And additionally, we're poised to capture the upside of the energy transition because, believe me, great wealth and prosperity will be created in the energy transition. But I think most importantly, my foundation is upholding its charitable mission. Philanthropic institutions receive charitable tax status to serve the public good. And if our investments are arguably undercutting the global public welfare, do we not have mission-level responsibility to act? The escalating climate crisis will impact the programs of all foundations, all philanthropic institutions, not just environmental ones, not just health-based ones. Whether we seek to end poverty, advance social justice, provide basic social services, or support arts and education, our work will be disrupted by extreme weather events, droughts, food system collapse, the spread of infectious diseases, and dislocations of populations. We must deploy all of our tools at our disposal to impact that crisis. And if these same investments are not only threatening our mission, but are financially risky in the near term and more so in the long term, don't we have a fiduciary responsibility to act to protect our future donations? Answering yes to that question, now 70 foundations worldwide have made a public pledge to divest from fossil fuels and invest in climate solutions. These commitments have been made in just over a year and include prominent UK, US, African, Australian, and Asian philanthropies. And if any of you have worked in philanthropy, you know that foundations don't collaborate well. And to think that we would collaborate not on the grants, but on the black box side of the house with the investments is unprecedented. And thank you. Another pause, you figured it out, you clapped that time, we're getting the rhythm down. So my foundation has supported this movement from the beginning. And we were involved in supporting some of the early convenings. We have supported many of the organizations that have been active. And we also launched Divest Invest Philanthropy. And I need to pause here and make some acknowledgements, if you will allow me and indulge me. First of all, to my incredible partners at the Wallace Global Fund, our trustees, the staff I work with, Richard Mott, Allison Barlow, Tina Kroll-Gersh. Allison Barlow is here tonight. Richard Mott, who is not here tonight, but whose office I constantly ran down in 2009, 2010. Now let's talk about this divestment idea. He'd be like, okay, enough, go back to your office. And I have to call out Tom Van Dyke, his remarkable team at RBC, who have shown that it can be done and has been showing that it can be done for quite a long time. My partner, Lisa Renstrom, in launching Divest Invest Philanthropy, and Jenna Nicholas, who carried the work forward, Clara Vondrich and David Fenton, our incredible communications team. But today, the U.S. Steering Committee of Divest Invest met. It's the most amazing group of people I've ever had the opportunity to work with, and almost all of them are in the room. There's too many for me to name individually, but I am going to ask you to stand up. This is the leadership of the divestment movement in this room. And please, would all of you stand up and be acknowledged for the work that you're doing. Come on, I will call you out if you don't stand up. Come on. Student leaders are in this room. People leading the faith community, hospitals, pension funds, cities, all here. So I just need to say that it's really the work, particularly of 350 and Carbon Tracker, has been historic and game-changing. So I have to say, I commend you all, I admire you all, and I'm honored to walk with you. but it's been unprecedented growth in a very, very short period of time. And while this growth in the movement and the movement's success cannot be measured by the number of institutions that commit to divestment, that is actually the wrong measure. The impact is already being felt by this movement with over 300 institutions committed to divestment, 1,200 individuals committed to divestment, or more. I probably have that number wrong. It changes every day. I can't keep up with it. But what's happening, and then I will wrap this up with a little bit of call to action. I just want to highlight what I think the success already is. This movement is building a much broader constituency for action on climate change. It has reached into individual congregations. It has inspired and mobilized people to call on their city councils to divest. It has connected faculty and students at universities all over this country and increasingly all over the world. And divestment has created an efficacious on-ramp for advocacy. The advocacy is popularizing the risks of stranded assets, moving that into the debates in the financial sector, exposing the problems with the business model of the fossil fuel industry, including the issue of CapEx. Quite frankly, it's targeting the right actor. It's putting the industry on the defensive. It's pressuring them to expose their shadow price on carbon and to reveal their climate risk scenarios, et cetera. It's setting up opportunity for accountability for those that are driving the problem. What did they know when? Think tobacco. The liability risk is only intensifying the financial risks of staying invested in fossil fuels. And it's demonstrating the need for and opportunities for investing in clean energy, framing a real debate about the industry's capital needs and viability, and opening the door for financing really innovative, democratic, transformative, decentralized energy projects, and creating more demand, but not nearly enough, for energy access for the world's majority. We can address poverty and climate change by providing solar energy to the world's majority, and we absolutely must. So 2015 is a year where change will happen, must happen. The agreement at Paris is unlikely to be sufficient. We must push the governments of the world to come up with the most ambitious plan possible, but we need to be clear, it is unlikely to be sufficient. And what that means is that we must continue our advocacy and continue to move markets to make this energy transition occur. We need to double down in our efforts to say no more exploration of fossil fuels. It is not okay to drill in the Arctic. It is not okay to continue to seek new sources of energy that we can't use, and we're going to have to continue those fights. And we need to push on the investment side of the equation so much more. We need to invest in this energy transition. Imagine, and I talked to Reverend Harper about this a lot, imagine if the world's faith community and foundation community would put 1% of its investments towards energy access for the world's majority. Imagine the amount of capital that could go. Imagine if universities created a power core and made it available for their students to spend a semester installing solar panels on hospitals and in villages around the world. That's the kind of bold and creative work that we have to unleash now, not 10 years from now, but now. So I guess what we're doing tonight is asking you to make a simple commitment to join this movement and to divest invest your own investments or that of your community or communities that you belong to. And that it is in this crazy year and critical year of 2015, Paris, the papal encyclical on the environment that will come out, the possibilities are really huge. But it's only us that can seize upon those opportunities. It's not somebody else that's going to do it. So at critical points in human history, profound change is required. This is our Underground Railroad moment, where people of courage and conviction stand up and take action, where individuals are all in, knitting together a beautiful quilt of advocacy, reinforcing each other's efforts and building power for change. You might actually work alone to bring about change in your small faith congregation, be the only voice advocating for divestment. You might be the lone voice on a board that you sit as a trustee, calling for that institution to divest. And you might be the first politician that refuses to take a campaign contribution from the fossil fuel industry. But you are part of a movement, advanced through collective leadership and unrelenting in the pursuit of achieving our goals. Ban Ki-moon, many others have said, we're the first generation to understand the depth of this problem and the last to be able to do something about it. So let me ask you, do you accept this responsibility? Yes. Are you all in? Yes. Will you bring your unique skills, networks, and creativity to accelerating the energy transition? Yes. That was rather tepid. I'm disappointed. Are you part of the solution? Yes. Okay, so commit today. These are on your table. Join Divest Invest, and we thank you.